So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the TUCO for the invitation to come and speak. It's great to see so many faces interested in palm. So my name is Jonathan Gorman. I work for Efeca, which is a small environmental consultancy. Prior to that, my background was in retail. I worked for Tesco, leading the programs on similar sort of topics, so on palm and soy and timber and beef, working with commercial teams and with suppliers to Tesco to put those policies and processes in place for Tesco supply chains, and on marine too. Prior to that, I worked in environmental health. And prior to that, I actually studied not too far away from here in the University of Salford. Long time ago now, in the days of the Hacienda, Happy Mondays, Strange prison riots, it was all going on at that time. Before the Salford Quays regeneration, life was a bit grittier. Maybe it is still a bit gritty, but so that's kind of my background. So what I'd like to do, I mean, essentially I'm a warm-up act for Judith, who's going to be talking to you about palm oil in more detail and the stuff you really want to know. Practically, what do I need to do? But I'm going to give you a little short introduction to deforestation, why we need to tackle it, why it's important to your businesses, your organisations, to your customers, to your students, and what help there is in order to begin to tackle it. So that's me. Just a quick note about Efeca and who we are. We're independent consultants, founded 2009. Interested in commodities that we might kind of term under the umbrella of forest commodities. So those that are linked to countries in the world where deforestation risk exists. So that's the sort of likes of soy and palm and timber and cocoa and others. So what Efeca does, I guess, is it works with the private sector, helping companies understand where their risks are, where do they source these products, how can they source them in a sustainable way. It also works in this sort of interface, in this space between public and private sector. So we're involved in round tables, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later, on soy and palm, funded by government, bringing the private sector together. So bringing companies together who have got a similar interest in sourcing a commodity, whether it's palm or soy, in a sustainable way, and figuring out how we can do this together. There are answers for deforestation. There are things that you can do, but there are also areas where we still need to work together to figure out how we make this kind of mass market shift and mass market change. So that's kind of what Efeca does, and some of the kind of spaces we work in, whether it's developing policy, implementing, monitoring, for government departments, for private sector, you can see a kind of range of those. In terms of the relevance to palm, I'll talk a little bit later about that, and so will Judith, but Efeca facilitates with funding from DFID the UK Roundtable on Sustainable Palm, and that's that forum where we bring industry players together, companies within the supply chain, to say, let's commit to sustainable palm, let's help each other, and Efeca provides a facilitation role and technical expertise to help people navigate that. So, deforestation. I think when we think about deforestation, we think of the environmental impact. So we think of obviously of forests disappearing and important biodiversity linked to those forests. So we think of iconic species like orangutan and the loss of those, and particularly related to palm oil. So those are the things that come into our mind. But it's not just the forest. It's not just the local impact, as important as they are. The loss of forest also affects the soils. So in Indonesia, where you might have forest growing on peat, once you remove the forest, the peat starts to dry up, the water table is affected. And in other parts of the world, in Brazil, once you lose the forest, once you lose the native vegetation, you start to lose the soil quality, and that affects future harvests and the livelihoods of people who rely on that. So that's kind of, I guess, where our immediate thoughts are when we think about deforestation. But there's also a global impact, a significant global impact in the loss of forests, and that's on climate and climate change. When you lose forest and you release carbon dioxide from peat that's drying out, you lose the ability for forests to take in that CO2. You are actually having an impact at a global level on climate change, and time is of the essence. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in October last year said that we are not on course. This planet is not on course, and the nations that are putting their plans to reduce carbon dioxide are not on course to hit this agreed target of no more than 1.5 degrees global warming. Any more than that, and we start to get into that state of the planet and state of climate warming where, you know, it's not something that we can mitigate. It's not something that we can live with. It starts to get into that kind of feedback cycle, and it gets warmer and warmer, and all of the, you know, weather changes that we see will be small compared to what we will see if we go beyond that. So we're not on course to achieve that. And part of the reason we're not on course to achieve that is deforestation. So this is an interesting statistic to take away with you, but it's estimated that sustainable land use, which includes avoiding deforestation, reforestation, could provide up to 1/3 of the greenhouse gas mitigation required by 2030. So forests have a global significance, and we need to reduce the amount of deforestation, we need to increase reforestation, and that will actually contribute to the wider and bigger target of you know, reducing the rate at which this planet is warming. It's sometimes called, and it's now called, a term they use called natural climate solution. So deforestation and avoiding deforestation is one of the things that we can do to tackle climate change. And I think the final thing on deforestation is these are environmental impacts. We should also not forget the social impacts of deforestation. For communities that live in forests, when those forests are taken away, they're often displaced. Land grabbing, land speculation are all rife within those countries where there is deforestation. We take land rights, and you know, when we buy a house, we know what we're getting. We know the curtilage of the property. We take all of those land rights for granted. They don't exist in all countries in the world, and when you lose forests, you often lose your livelihoods and your place to live. And there's also other social issues relating to the production of commodities. So that's when we think about deforestation, we should think about the local impacts, but we should also think about the global impacts, particularly on climate change. So what does this mean, and why is it important for the UK? Well, it's estimated that commercial agriculture accounts for about 3/4 of the destruction of tropical forests. This graph here, this pie chart here, was put together by 3Keel on behalf of WWF, and it represents, in a report called Risky Business, and it represents our overseas land footprint. So the amount of land devoted to the growth or the cultivation of those commodities that we use in the UK. So the graph here, the biggest chunk we can see there is beef and leather, and that represents the biggest footprint for the UK for commodities that can have an impact on deforestation, which seems a bit odd in some ways because most of the beef that we consume in the UK is actually reared in the UK. But beef, when you look at it, and cattle outside of the UK in places like Brazil are grown in very extensive production systems, so lots of hectares per head of cattle, and that's why that footprint is actually quite big. The second biggest footprint for the UK for commodities that are linked to deforestation is timber. In actual fact, timber, although it's got a big footprint, we use a lot of pulp and paper and timber. A lot of timber comes from countries with a fairly low risk of deforestation. So aside from places like China and Russia, where we do import some timber, if you look in Western Europe, a lot of those forests, most of those forests are all sustainably cultivated, sustainably managed. Although if you go back hundreds of years, we would have all in Europe had natural forests. We deforested many, many years ago. But timber, nonetheless, it's a big footprint, but in terms of its risk now, I would suggest, other than areas like China and maybe Russia, where there is still a risk of deforestation, a lot of that is a low risk footprint. And then we come to soy and palm oil. Fairly significant chunks, about 3 million hectares between them of land, effectively represents the amount of palm oil and soy that is imported and used within the UK. And overall, the conclusion of this report was that more than 40% of the UK's overseas land footprint, that's about 6 million hectares, is in countries at high or very high risk of deforestation, with weak governance, so may have laws in place but not necessarily enforced, and poor labour standards. So although the UK is a very small blip in terms of, Kevin just talked about the amount of palm oil that we refine in the UK, although it's very small, it's very important still. And we do have a link back through all of our supply chains to countries in the world where deforestation is happening now. So we can't change that, but we can certainly have a part, and we can play our part in helping to change that. So let's just look at a couple of commodities. We're going to be talking about palm a lot today. And as Kevin and Judith will allude to as well, it's in a huge amount of products, from shaving creams to cosmetics to donuts to Rocky Caramel biscuits, etc., etc. So it's all around us. It's the most widely grown and widely used vegetable oil globally. Nearly 2/3 come from just a small number of countries, from Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. And it's been a success story in lots of ways. The growth of palm oil in the last 20 or 30 years has been phenomenal. I guess for lots of the reasons that you've said, Kevin. It's incredibly versatile, good value product. It works in so many different products in so many different ways. But the history of palm oil, I'm afraid undoubtedly, is that it has been linked to deforestation, to land grabbing, to forced labour and other abusive practices, particularly affecting migrant workers. And although we knew about deforestation some time ago, some of these issues, like the social issues, have really only come up in the sort of wider knowledge in the last 4 or 5 years. So migrant labour, a lot of workers from the Philippines will go down to Malaysia or to Indonesia and work on the plantations. We didn't really know a huge amount about that until the last 4 or 5 years, and we're getting more knowledgeable about that. So palm oil has a history associated with deforestation. It also has a history in the last 10, 15 years of people recognising that and beginning to do something about it. And the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO, which you're all aware of, really was the vanguard, led that kind of movement in getting everybody from the growers to the retailers together and saying, we need to do something. We need to set up a standard. We need to understand what sustainable palm oil can be and how we can grow it, and bring it to market. And it's been hugely successful in doing that. I think 19-20% of total global palm oil is now certified to the RSPO standard, which you might say 20%, that's not a lot. Actually, compared to a lot of other certification schemes like FSC or MSC, it's actually a really successful standard. But lots more to do, and that's why it's great to come here and talk to you, because everybody needs to play their part. Soy is the commodity that I've worked on in the last 18 months, probably more than palm. It's another kind of hidden ingredient, really. The guy at the back there was talking about what would a customer see, and how would they know if palm oil is in a product or if soy oil is a product. And probably most customers would not realise how much soy ultimately is embedded in the products that they buy. So again, I think you mentioned, Kevin, soy is really important in poultry and in pork, but also in eggs and in dairy. 90% of soy imported into Europe is used in animal feed. So it's fed to animals, and a lot of that is going to be from South America and from the USA. Why? Because it's good value, because if it's grown in South America, the protein value is just right, and for animal feed, it's a matter of making sure you get the right mix of protein. So soy expansion has also been associated with deforestation. In the Amazon, originally, probably 10 years ago, that was where the focus was. Actually, a fantastic bit of work was done in the Amazon, so that a moratorium was created whereby no beans now come out of the Amazon that are associated with deforestation. However, soy and meat production continues to increase, and so soy production now has leaked out into other areas like the Cerrado. The Cerrado is in Brazil, about half the size of Western Europe, contains 5% of the global biodiversity, and that's the one that has, in the last kind of couple of years, hit more of the headlines and is a bit of a sort of warning sign to us all that actually we need to think about the Cerrado, we need to think about soy as well. So what's the case for action then? I mean, you know, you're all reasonable, responsible people, and I think it's kind of fairly obvious that acting responsibly within your supply chains, playing your part, is the right thing to do for all businesses. You know, whether you're a Nestle, a Mars, a university, a catering organisation, corporate responsibility has gone beyond now just putting out a report every year saying we gave some money to charity. It's actually about looking in your supply chains and saying what are we proactively doing. And I think there's also a really important commercial reason why we should be interested in this. We rely, as I've just said, on most of our soy to come from South America. If that soy is not produced sustainably, if future crops fail, then where's the protein going to come from the animal feed that goes into the meat that we sell? So this is about security of supply for the ingredients that we all depend on. The same with palm. There are no cost-effective alternatives to palm that functionally do what we want them to do and that don't have any environmental impact themselves. You know, if you switch to coconut oil, if you switch to shea, they all have environmental impact. So this is a sort of business continuity issue as well. We need to be confident that we can continue to source these ingredients. And I think finally, customer, I use customer in the broad term, whether it's your students, you know, whether it's the final customer. You know, the story of palm oil in the last 6 months has shown that customers get this, but they often see the world, depending on who's telling them, in a black or white function. Is it good or is it bad? Is palm oil bad or is it good? It's much more difficult to think, well, some palm oil might not be good and some might be bad. The life is more complicated. So often if you don't get the message out there, then customers will react and they'll take you down a route, and that may be not the route you want to go. And perhaps Iceland are realising some of that now. So I think there's a really good case for action. What can I do as a business? Well, there are lots of ways you can engage, and Judith will talk you through some of the details of this. Iceland in the last 6 or 8 months have said we're going to remove all palm oil from our products, which I think it's been helpful in highlighting the issue. There's no doubt there's a huge amount more talked about on palm oil in the last 6 months than there have been in the last 6 years. We would probably argue that the solution's a little bit more complicated. They're probably finding that it's not actually that easy to replace palm oil. The world is not quite so binary. You know, our view would be that it's really the danger is you're displacing certification or displacing deforestation. You're shifting the burden if you move to other oils, and you're probably not getting the functionality you want. Life is probably not so simple as that. And there are options like certified sustainable palm, and that's really, I guess, where Roundtable on Sustainable Palm came from. It's how do we get together and find solutions to these problems. And in terms of where do I go to get help, again, we'll be talking about that for the rest of the day. But the Roundtables on Sustainable Palm Oil were an initiative that the government set up in 2012 when the government said, we're going to put a statement out on palm oil to say that by 2015, all of the palm oil that's imported into the UK should be from a credibly certified source. And a lot of work has gone on through that roundtable and through the efforts of retailers and others. And actually, I think the 2000 statistics say that about 75% of total palm imports are now to a credible certified standard, which is brilliant. And the government have been involved in that. They've set a government buying standard, which may well have filtered down to you, which specifies sustainable palm oil in the palm oil that is being used within government. So the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm is something that is open to everybody to join. We meet 3 times a year. The next meeting is on April the 4th. It includes trade associations, it includes companies, and it's really facilitated by Efeca, and it's really there designed to help whether you are a company that's starting the journey and saying, what is sustainable palm? How do I buy it? How do I specify it? Or whether you're somebody that's gone some way down that route and you want to know, how do I go further and faster? You know, that's available to you. And we're hopefully going to be starting up a public sector working group as part of that roundtable shortly, because that's a sector that we really think has got the appetite to do more, and we'd like to support particularly. So lots of help available, and the roundtable on palm oil is one that you can join. my role when I joined Efeca was to set up the Roundtable on Sustainable Soy, which again is up and running, meets on the same frequency and meets on April the 4th. I talked a little bit about soy. Happy to talk to you after, during the day if you want to know more. But that's another one where the Roundtable does the same thing. If you're concerned about soy within your supply chains, join up, meet with others, figure out how you can work together to improve soy within your supply chains. So I know I'm being pushed, so just 2 more slides. One is to say we're not doing this on our own. So the UK has taken a lead on a lot of these commodities and sustainability, but there are other countries, so those countries there are all part of what they call the Amsterdam Declarations Partnership. So it's governments in each of those countries all committing to help their private sector, their companies, to source sustainable palm, soy and other commodities. And I think it's really important that we all work together, not just in the UK. We don't want a bespoke solution for palm oil for the UK. Commodities, as you know, don't work like that. So we need to expand and use the leverage of other consuming countries, and Europe is one. So my final kind of, I guess, key messages, take-out messages would be the case for action on deforestation, I think, is pretty clear. It's a cliche, but we have our role to play, whether you're business, consumers, government, civil society. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be an expert. We've got experts here, as you have seen. There are places to start this journey and things that you can do straight away. Palm oil is ubiquitous. There's no doubt it will be important to your business somewhere, as will soy. And overwhelmingly, palm oil and soy can be cultivated, can be grown in a sustainable way. This is not a binary good or bad discussion. This is about putting in the hard effort and the work to ensure that you're specifying all the way down the supply chain sustainable palm, and it is available, it's on the market. So lots I've talked through there, but that's my introduction. So Judith, please join me. Thank you very much.